Hello everyone, welcome back. This is going to be kind of a history on Frigidaire as a brand itself. So when we go back and look at the beginning of Frigidaire, we kind of also have to look at what was going on at the time with refrigeration in general and how different brands were bringing refrigeration into the home. The very first refrigerator that was actually available for purchase as a unit that was already kind of assembled and backed by a company was by General Electric in 1911. This unit was called the Audifren, named after a French monk who they bought the rights from, and it was the very first hermetic unit ever developed. In a later video where I go over the DR monitor top, I'm going to go into the Audifren in more detail. But just know that in 1911, this was the very first electrically driven compressor that you could actually get for a refrigerator in the home. Then in 1913, a new company called Domelry, kind of hard to pronounce, it stands for Domestic Electric Refrigerator, marketed the very first packaged unit. It was an all-in-one packaged unit that was supposed to go on top of your existing icebox. It's a pretty neat design, actually. It used a belt-driven compressor, pretty normal, but it had an air-cooled condenser surrounding the entire setup that went on top. That was different. That had never been done before. Kind of interesting. Then, in 1915, the Guardian Refrigerator Company was formed in Fort Wayne, Indiana. They produced more conventional belt drive units that were installed on the outside of the kitchen. Well, what do I mean by that? Back then, your unit, aside from that Domelry that I mentioned earlier, the unit was not in the refrigerator at all. It was actually installed remotely, either in the basement or outside under a cover, but it wasn't actually in the refrigerator itself. In 1916, they produced the very first self-contained refrigerator. Does that mean the compressor was in the refrigerator cabinet yet? No, not yet. What that meant was that the evaporator was actually meant to go with the cabinet of the refrigerator for the very first time. Before, again, you would have had an ice box that was converted. This was the very first time that you actually had a, quote, refrigerator cabinet instead of an ice box. Then, in 1916, a new company came onto the market, Kelvinator. They started producing units similar to the Guardian Company. They would become a big driving force for sales in the budding refrigerator market and put a good-sized dent in Guardian sales. The Guardian Company was struggling by 1918 whenever William C. Durant, founder of General Motors, invested in the company. They had only managed to produce about 40 refrigerators in the time that they had been a company. This lackluster production meant that the company was about to be bankrupt, hence why the founder of General Motors invested in them. He saw a good product with Guardian, and that's why he decided to invest with them. By 1919, Durant completely bought out Guardian and renamed the company Frigidaire. With the backing of Big Daddy GM, Frigidaire really took off. GM applied the same mass production techniques that were winning them profits in the manufacture of automobiles towards the building of refrigerators. So, whereas before, no refrigeration company had ever used the assembly line technique, now GM decided to apply the mass production techniques to Frigidaire, and this worked. It worked very well. So well, in fact, that after a couple years, by 1924, they started turning a profit, and GM knew that they had a winner. Always hot on their heels, though, in 1925, Kelvinator turned the fridge world on its ear by introducing the world's first all-in-one refrigerator. Now the compressor and all of the refrigerating mechanism was inside the same cabinet that the food was kept. For the first time, you no longer had to cut up your kitchen floor to run pipework to a remote condensing unit. This was a huge step forward, and it really bolstered Kelvinator's sales. Frigidaire was soon to follow after with their own all-in-one model. Then, in 1927, the entire refrigerating world was again turned on its ear by General Electric. This time it was the monitor top that caught everybody's attention, and the fact that it was the first mass-marketed, mass-appealed, and much cheaper hermetically sealed unit. Sure, they had had the Audifrin unit many years before, but that was a $1,000 refrigerator. Now they had refrigerators priced much more reasonably so that many more people could afford them. And, best of all, the unit sat on top of the refrigerating cabinet instead of having to be placed elsewhere. Frigidaire didn't take this sitting down, however. In order to produce what they deemed an ideal refrigerator, they started work on two projects at the same time. First, they started developing a series of refrigerants that would become known as CFCs. Then, they decided to produce their own hermetically sealed unit to beat General Electric at their own game. They started working on the refrigerants as early as 1930, and they worked on them through 1935. Charles Kettering, vice president of General Motors Research Corporation, was the one seeking a refrigerant replacement. He wanted something that would be colorless, odorless, tasteless, non-toxic, and non-flammable. This was considered impossible at the time, but he teamed up with a team of scientists that were also working with DuPont, who was helping Frigidaire. Together, they created the much-loved R12, R11, R22, R113, and R114, which is the refrigerant that Frigidaire eventually decided to go with to use in their own home refrigerators. Of course, R12, R22, and R11 found many, many uses after that. In 1933, the Metermiser compressor, which was Frigidaire's hermetic unit, was introduced. By 1935, the entire line of standard refrigerators from Frigidaire had this compressor. The larger models still used belt drive units. However, they switched from using sulfur dioxide to R12. All of the Metermisers at this point were using R114.
After research came testing and proving. Testing and proving that is still going on. In this 110-degree room, the new Frigidaire goes into the ring with models of other makes to see how it measures up. In the humidity room, insulation and cabinet sealing of the new Frigidaire are subjected to the hardest of tests in an atmosphere saturated with moisture. We're ready to get at the heart of this Frigidaire, the new rotary compressor. Inside that steel housing is the utmost in accuracy, simplicity, quality, and efficiency. It is the modern refrigerating mechanism. Let's take it apart and see what we find. Off comes the housing, then the field of the motor, the armature, the cylinder cap and valve plate, and then the cylinder. What we have left are the three moving parts and the base on which they rest. These three parts are the only parts that move in this rotary compressor. Because it has only three moving parts, this is the simplest compressor in the world. Now for the third moving part, the divider block. A metal saw cuts divider blocks out of solid steel, 3 at a time. Then the blocks go through grinders, spinning away on the tough steel. And here's how the surface looks after the first grinding operation. That's not smooth enough, so we give it another grinding. and another, another, and another. And still a Frigidaire engineer wouldn't call that surface smooth. So it goes through this lapping operation, where it's rubbed between two surfaces that grind as gently as water dripping on rock. And then with infinite care and patience, the blocks are slowly rubbed back and forth on a finishing plate, until each block, even when highly magnified, is as smooth as the surface of a plate of glass without a flaw. Then only does Frigidaire say, smooth enough. The instrument in front of this inspector is an electrolimit gauge. It has diamond points. It measures each impeller on each surface and on each edge. The only thing unusual about this gauge is that it measures in 100,000ths of an inch. If the temperature were allowed to fluctuate, the expansion and contraction of the metal parts would make the gauge readings meaningless. Why, even the heat of an ordinary flashlight beam will expand a strip of metal so much that the pointer on this delicate gauge moves off the dial. With precision control like that, no wonder it's necessary to hold each part in the air-conditioned inspection room for 3 hours before it's tested. It's the only way to be sure that all parts are the same temperature when they go under the gauge. That's why, in 1936, Frigidaire again stepped out in front with this dependable, durable, economical, efficient, and foolproof mechanism. The simplest compressor ever built. In 1936, the sealed mechanism is in the entire line of new cabinets.
So they did have quite a presence early on, and I think part of that also has to do with all of the other stuff that they were making that was refrigerated. They really had an aggressive line of products that were able to kind of make them a household name. Such examples of products made in the 20s would be many very different types of water coolers. You also had a wide variety of ice cream cabinets, which were popular in soda fountains. And speaking of soda fountains, they also made those. Big, huge models with lots and lots of space for all kinds of syrups and whatnot. Pretty cool, actually. It kind of looks complicated as far as it almost looks like a brine system set up around all of the ice cream and everything else. I'm not really sure. They also made a wide variety of walk-in cooler accessories, stuff that would actually, refrigerate a walk-in cooler. So they became well known in restaurants. They also became well known in bars because they made beer coolers. If you had a bar that was big enough back then to have kegs, they actually had a Frigidaire keg cooler. And let's not forget that Frigidaire was one of the first, if not the first, to make room air conditioners. And what I mean by that is a self-contained unit that included the whole refrigerating mechanism. You could just set it in a room anywhere. It was pretty neat. Obviously, people got a good impression of Frigidaire from that because it was the first air conditioner that they presumably had, unless you were ultra wealthy and were able to get some sort of home-done version installed by a local company. In the 1950s, Frigidaire came out with all kinds of interesting developments. They kind of continued on the Cold Wall theme in the late 50s, whenever they made a series of refrigerators that actually had cooling coils beneath the floor of the refrigerator to cool off the vegetable bins. However, they had moved to a flat plate at the back of the refrigerator section for the main cooling of the refrigerator cavity. The freezer section was still separate at this point, though. This design was called the Cyclomatic, and the reason it was called Cyclomatic is because the refrigerator would turn off for a long enough period of time for this flat plate to actually have the frost melt off and then flow into a drain. I've got a Norge that actually has a very similar setup. Frigidaire continued to use their traditional meter miser compressor well into the 1950s and beyond. So what did they focus on for the most part during the 1950s? Style. Every year they made a different style of refrigerator, and not only that, but in 1957 they developed the sheer look refrigerator, which, horror of horrors, finally got rid of those rounded edges and made the same basic boring shape that we all know today. This point is where Frigidaire jumped the shark. And these refrigerators were very popular, mind you. People actually liked the look of something different, and I understand that. But looking back on them now, they just kind of look boring when you compare it to those voluptuous curves of the models from years before. Time hasn't looked as favorably on these squared off models, because now everything looks like this, and we just think of it as a box. Just a box to put our food in whenever it's cold, and that right there is what Frigidaire became, a box to put your food in. As the 1970s wore on, Frigidaire was losing more and more money. Instead of plowing money into research and development of new methods and new models of refrigerators, they continued the same lines year after year and kind of played catch up to all of the other manufacturers who were pushing out more and more interesting features, new features that Frigidaire once was known for. By 1979, the honeymoon was over, and Frigidaire got bought up by White Consolidated Industries. They joined a laundry list of industries in the appliance business that were bought up before them. Westinghouse, which was bought up in 1975, not too long before. Kelvinator and Philco were bought up earlier as well. It's kind of sad that all of these brands just kind of slowly withered on this vine, but you can't blame White Consolidated Industries completely. These companies were turning out less and less profit every year. It kind of makes you wonder if a manager were to come into Frigidaire or Westinghouse or one of these other companies before they had really tanked and kind of invested into some new ideas into them, I wonder if they would still be their own business now. Heck, even General Electric is talking about getting rid of their appliance division now. It's like nobody really has any imaginative thinking whenever it comes to these machines anymore. In 1986, White themselves were bought out by Electrolux, and that's where we are today. That Frigidaire that was once made by General Motors, proudly made by General Motors in Detroit, is now made by Electrolux in who knows where. Just like one of many, many other appliances that you buy, it's not special. It really isn't. Even the nicer models have Samsung compressors in them. Yeah, that's right. The same company that makes that phone that catches on fire? Yeah, they're the ones making your compressor now. Say goodbye to the Meter Miser. This compressor is seen light in many, many models nowadays, including some General Electric models that I've seen. Just insane. And not only that, but there have been rumors of problems about Frigidaire's build quality in general. I've got a story that I'll tell about one of my friends. My friend Drew, actually, who helps me film these films. You see, this all comes full circle. My friend Drew bought a house a few years ago. Finally, he was a homeowner. He was proud of what he had, and he still is. Unfortunately, whoever bought the refrigerator before him had bought a Frigidaire. Now, this fridge is not old. When he bought the house, it was only about, let's say 5 years old. And when it died, it was only a couple years older than that. Why did it die, you ask? Well, it's kind of complicated, so bear with me. First off, the door and the hinges on the door just got slap worn out to where the door wouldn't even close right anymore. In fact, you had to kind of halfway pick up the door just to even be able to close it. This led to it running very, very hard because You know, roommates don't really know how to close doors right. I know that's true. And they didn't really check to make sure that the door was fully closed, so out comes all that cold air. Well, that made the fridge run constantly, and it also made the evaporator frost up quite a bit. But this doesn't end where you think it's going to end. The fridge would have kept running on fine if it had not been for one lousy detail. For some sick, twisted, sadistic reason, those Frigidaire engineers put the discharge line coming straight from the compressor right underneath the defrost drain that carries the defrost water from the evaporator. Think about that for a second. They put the line directly underneath the drain where it would get dripped on every time your refrigerator defrosts itself. You know, maybe once a day or so. Think about that. Eventually, because it's made of steel and just has cheap paint on it, it rusted out. And guess what? It lost all of its refrigerant. So, I would love to tell the EPA about Frigidaire's faux pas here and get them to be able to pay some sort of fine, like that's ever going to happen. It just goes to show you, these things really do have a shelf life designed into them. There was no mistake about this. This wasn't some sort of factory error. This was done on purpose. There is absolutely no reason why defrost water would need to drip on a condenser line. It just makes me mad. Why? Why would you do that? You're shooting yourself in the foot. The next time somebody thinks about Frigidaire, they're going to think, oh, that's that crappy refrigerator that died in 7 years after we bought it. Gee, let's buy a GE. Even though they really don't know that GE really doesn't make anything themselves either. Ugh. Global products, I swear. After that, Drew had a bad taste in his mouth, and he wanted to get it out promptly. He was in need of a refrigerator. He actually had an old refrigerator in his basement that he was using for time being. Think late 70s GE. It was extremely rusty, but it still ran good. He wanted something prettier to put in his kitchen, though. And I jokingly offered him my 1955 Westinghouse that I had just recently painted, but didn't really use anymore because I had a monitor top to use now. He actually accepted the offer. I was surprised. He bought it from me, and now, this man, with his girlfriend and roommate, is actually using a 1955 refrigerator as their main fridge. He loves it, and it's been reliable for him for quite some time now. I'm amazed that he's able to fit all the food that he has into this tiny little compartment. The freezer is just crammed full, but he wouldn't have it any other way, because he knows that this thing has stood the test of time, and it's not going to have a line rust through just because someone wanted it to. He knows that if it breaks, it's served its time, and it's deserving of our admiration.